Welcome back to Books and Banter, everybody. You guys ready to get a little bit uncomfortable today?
Always.
Because I am. Today we are talking about a book called Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser. And this one was a doozy.
It is. I mean, this one is, it's very well researched. It's fascinating. It's hard to put down.
It is. And so full of things that I was like, I can't believe I didn't know this. Like, this has been happening all around me this whole time.
Absolutely. I had the same exact experience reading it.
So if you have ever, like, even thought about getting fast food or have eaten fast food, this book, I think, is going to really change your perspective.
If you live in America, you've been impacted by the fast food industry. I think that's really what the book gets at.
Absolutely. So let's just jump right in here because there is so much to cover. This book does a really great job of giving us a good history of like how fast food even came to be.
Yeah, it goes all the way back to, humble beginnings. Like you've got Karcher starting Carl's Jr. selling hot dogs from a push cart. Yeah, in LA. And then, of course, Ray Kroc with McDonald's taking a relatively small operation and turning it into this global phenomenon.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how it all evolved. Wow. But one of the things that I found really fascinating was the connection that Schlosser makes between fast food and like Disneyland.
Oh, yeah.
And this idea of like this manufactured American dream kind of fantasy.
It's kind of this corporate-sponsored view of American life, right? Where you go and everything is clean, everything is convenient, everything's predictable. It's...
Yeah, there's no surprises.
Yeah, exactly. You go. You know what you're going to get.
Yeah. It's presented in a way that's supposed to be like the ideal.
Absolutely. But there's a sort of, darker side to that comparison, too. And Schlosser points this out. He reminds us that, Walt Disney worked with Wernher von Braun, a former Nazi scientist, for the development of Tomorrowland.
Okay, I did not know that.
Yeah. And the House of the Future exhibit was sponsored by Monsanto, the chemical giant.
So it's like this weird, this weird juxtaposition of like this idealized future, but it's brought to you by like
these forces that maybe.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to another section that I found really fascinating, kind of terrifying, which is the way that these fast food companies target children.
Yes. I mean,
they were pioneers in understanding the power of marketing to children.
Yeah.
I mean, really, you think about it. Ronald McDonald is this global icon.
I mean...
Everybody.
And the original Ronald McDonald was too overweight to be Ronald McDonald.
I know. Isn't that wild? Like, they thought he was too overweight to sell burgers.
It's like, all about image, though.
It's all about image.
Yeah.
And they don't just, stop at Ronald McDonald. They're also creating these playgrounds that are specifically designed to get you to come inside and spend money.
Yeah, Schlosser uses that phrase, bring in money, to talk about the playgrounds. And then, of course, you've got partnerships with schools. And just the sheer volume of advertising aimed at kids is mind-boggling.
Schlosser says that children see something like 30,000 commercials a year.
It's wild. And it's hard to escape.
Yeah, no wonder I wanted a Happy Meal when I was a kid.
Exactly. Right. And then you've got things like Pizza Hut's Book It program, which on the surface seems like a good thing, right? Like encouraging reading, but it raises all these ethical questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, how much influence should corporations have in schools?
Yeah.
Right. And
what are they really trying to achieve here?
Right. Are they really trying to get kids to read, or are they just trying to sell more pizza?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, we've kind of talked about the corporations, but one of the things that I think Schlosser does a really good job of is humanizing the people that work in these fast food restaurants. And one of the stories that he shares is the story of Elisa, who is a teenager who works at Burger King in Colorado Springs.
Yeah. And her story is just one example of how much this industry relies on teenagers to be the bulk of their workforce.
And they do this for a reason.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
They know that teenagers are going to work for less.
They need jobs.
They need jobs.
They don't necessarily have the same kind of, leverage to demand higher wages or better conditions.
They're much less likely to try to unionize.
Yeah, exactly. And the work itself is, incredibly systematized and controlled. Like Schlosser talks about manuals that dictate every single action that a worker is supposed to take.
Like the McDonald's Bible.
Yes, exactly. It's kind of fascinating. He even talks about a manager who showed him a system that could predict orders based on customer flow. Like, it's crazy how much technology is driving this industry.
It's like they're trying to eliminate the human element as much as possible.
It does kind of feel that way, yeah.
And of course, there's the high turnover rate in the fast food industry.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
what'd you guess?
People aren't staying there for long.
They're not staying there for long. And Schlosser talks about how these companies even take advantage of federal subsidies for worker training,
Yeah, because they know that they're going to have to train new employees constantly.
right? So they're getting money from the government to train these people that they know are only going to be there for a few months.
It's a system that works for them.
Yes, but maybe not for the workers.
Right.
So what about unions? Like, I would imagine that it's pretty tough to unionize in the fast food industry.
It is. Schlosser actually talks about a McDonald's that shut down entirely to avoid a union drive.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they're really resistant to workers having any kind of collective bargaining power.
That's pretty scary.
It is. And he also shares some pretty harrowing anecdotes about the risks that fast food workers face, especially those working late night shifts.
Yeah, the lack of security measures in some of these places is really alarming.
Yeah, it's not a safe job by any means.
So we've got this image of this corporate-controlled utopia on one hand, and then on the other hand, you have these workers who are being exploited and put at risk.
Right, and that's really the story that Schlosser is trying to tell in Fast Food Nation.
It's a story about the hidden costs of convenience.
Absolutely, and we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, in part 2 of this deep dive, we're going to get even deeper into the underbelly of the fast food industry when we explore the meatpacking world. And things are going to get a little bit more intense.
Oh yeah, buckle up. And if you thought the fast food restaurants were bad, just wait until you hear about the meatpacking industry.
Yeah, I feel like we're about to go full the jungle here.
Pretty much, Schlosser doesn't hold back in this section. It's where things get really dark and disturbing.
So what makes the meatpacking industry so different from what we've talked about so far?
Well, it's the same basic mentality, just on a much larger and more brutal scale. It's all about throughput, maximizing production at any cost.
So the same obsession with speed and efficiency that drives the fast food restaurant.
Exactly. And just like in the restaurants, it's the workers who pay the price for this relentless pursuit of profit.
Schlosser talks a lot about IBP, this meatpacking giant that pretty much revolutionized the industry.
Right. IBP was all about streamlining the process, cutting costs, increasing efficiency. But this so-called revolution came at a huge cost for the workers.
What were conditions like in these slaughterhouses?
Brutal. Dangerous, dehumanizing. Schlosser doesn't sugarcoat it. These places are like nightmares fueled by blood and guts.
It's hard to even imagine.
They rely heavily on immigrant labor, often undocumented. And these workers are subjected to some of the most horrific working conditions you can imagine.
It's just sickening to think about people being treated like that.
Schlosser tells these stories of workers suffering from carpal tunnel syndrome, back injuries, lacerations, you name it.
And it sounds like the system is set up to keep them silent and powerless.
Absolutely. They're afraid to speak out for fear of losing their jobs or being deported.
It's a recipe for exploitation.
And it's not just the workers who suffer. Schlosser also talks about the impact on entire communities, like Lexington, Nebraska.
What happened in Lexington?
As the meatpacking industry boomed, Lexington became this magnet for immigrant workers. The population exploded, but the influx of new residents put a strain on resources and led to social tensions.
So it wasn't this happy story of economic prosperity for everyone.
Not at all. Schlosser shows how the meatpacking industry can have these really complex and often negative impacts on the communities where it sets up shop.
Okay, so we've talked about the workers in the communities, but what about the food itself? Surely there are safety regulations in place to protect consumers.
Well, that's where things get even more unsettling. Schlosser opens this section with a heartbreaking story about a young boy named Alex Donnelly who almost died from E. coli after eating a contaminated Jack-in-the-Box hamburger.
Oh my God. That's terrifying.
It's a reminder that there are real dangers lurking in our food supply and that the system isn't always equipped to protect us.
So how did this happen? What went wrong?
Schlosser explains how E. coli 0157 by H7, this particularly nasty strain of bacteria, can easily contaminate ground beef. And it's incredibly difficult to eliminate.
So how do we prevent these kinds of outbreaks?
Well, Schlosser takes us on a journey through the history of food safety regulations, starting with Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which exposed the horrors of the Chicago meatpacking industry back in the early 1900s.
I remember reading that book. It was pretty graphic.
It was a wake-up call that led to some of the first major food safety reforms in the U.S. But Schlosser argues that the industry has consistently resisted stricter regulations, putting profit ahead of public health.
It's a tale as old as time. Corporate greed versus consumer safety.
And even when regulations are put in place, they're not always effective. Schlosser points to the streamlined inspection system for cattle, or SISC, as an example.
What's that?
It was supposed to streamline inspections and improve efficiency, But critics argue that it actually reduced federal oversight in slaughterhouses and shifted responsibility to the companies themselves.
So the fox guarding the henhouse.
Exactly. It's a recipe for disaster.
It's scary to think that the safety of our food could be left in the hands of corporations that are motivated by profit.
It's a valid concern. But Schlosser does highlight a case where a company went above and beyond Jack in the Box after the E. coli outbreak, implemented this rigorous testing program that was far ahead of industry standards at the time.
So there are some companies that take food safety seriously.
Yes, but are these isolated cases enough to protect the public? Schlosser also talks about the Hudson Foods recall, where millions of pounds of ground beef were contaminated with E. coli, and the USDA was initially reluctant to inform the public about the tainted meat.
They were more worried about protecting the industry than protecting consumers.
It does make you wonder who's looking out for our best interests. And then there's the debate over irradiation, a process that can effectively kill bacteria in food.
I've heard of that, but a lot of people are wary of it.
I understand that. People are naturally suspicious of anything that sounds like radiation. But Schlosser points out that the meat going to fast food chains is often irradiated, while the meat sold to the general public is not.
So there's a double standard when it comes to food safety.
It seems that way, and it raises questions about equity and access, who gets the safest food and at what cost.
It's a lot to think about. This book is really making me question everything I thought I knew about food.
That's the power of Fast Food Nation. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths about the food we eat.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the workers, the industry, the food itself. But this fast food thing, it's not just an American phenomenon anymore, is it?
It's not. Schlosser talks about how the spread of fast food is almost like a metaphor for the spread of American culture as a whole.
Yeah, you see McDonald's and KFCs everywhere you go these days.
Exactly. They're often the first multinationals to arrive in developing countries, and their impact can be pretty complicated.
On the one hand, you have jobs and investment. On the other hand, you have concerns about cultural homogenization and the displacement of local businesses.
Right. It's a double-edged sword. And Schlosser uses the McDonald's libel trial, the McLibel case, to illustrate this tension.
Oh, yeah. I remember hearing about that. Two activists in the UK went up against McDonald's over their claims about food and labor practices.
It was a David versus Goliath story, and it dragged on for years, becoming this huge media spectacle.
What was the outcome?
It was a partial victory for the activists. The court did find McDonald's guilty of some of the charges, like exploiting children through advertising and misleading the public about the nutritional value of their food.
Wow.
But it was a long and costly battle, and it really highlighted the immense power that these corporations have.
It's kind of scary to think about going up against a giant like that.
It is. And then you have things like that controversy over a McDonald's opening near the Dachau concentration camp.
Oh, yeah, that was a PR nightmare.
It was just tone deaf. It shows how the pursuit of profit can blind these companies to cultural sensitivities and historical context.
It's like they just bulldoze their way in without any regard for the local community.
And Schlosser doesn't just talk about the global expansion of fast food. He also takes a look at the future of the industry. And it's not all sunshine and Happy Meals.
Really, I would have thought that the fast food train was unstoppable at this point.
Well, there are signs that the industry is starting to feel the pressure, particularly the big chains.
What is driving that shift?
I think there are a few factors. One is the growing concern about health. Obesity rates are skyrocketing, and people are starting to connect the dots between processed food and chronic diseases.
We're also seeing more documentaries and exposés that are revealing the ugly truth about how our food is produced.
Right. Consumers are becoming more informed and more demanding. They want transparency and accountability.
And let's not forget about the ethical concerns. The labor exploitation, the animal welfare issues, the environmental damage.
All of that is playing a role. People are starting to realize that cheap and convenient food comes at a price.
It's like we're finally waking up to the true cost of our convenience.
And Schlosser also talks about the rise of smaller regional chains like In-Out Burger that focus on fresh ingredients and better treatment of their employees.
It seems like people are looking for alternatives.
They are, and social media is playing a huge role in this shift. People are sharing their experiences, good and bad, and holding companies accountable.
One viral video can make or break a brand these days.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? What can we do to change the fast food landscape?
That's the million-dollar question.
Schlosser doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does encourage us to become more conscious consumers. Vote with our dollars. Support businesses that align with our values. Demand transparency. Hold those in power accountable.
It's about making informed choices and recognizing that every purchase is a vote for the kind of world we want to live in.
Exactly. And we can amplify our impact by supporting organizations that are fighting for better working conditions, promoting sustainable agriculture, advocating for food justice.
Wow, this book has really given me a lot to think about. It's definitely changed the way I look at fast food.
That's the power of a good book.
Yeah.
It can open our eyes to new perspectives and inspire us to make a difference.
Well said. So, Books and Banter fam, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Fast Food Nation. If you haven't read it yet, we highly recommend checking it out. It's a powerful and thought-provoking book that will stay with you long after you finish it.
And be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you read Fast Food Nation? What are your experiences with the fast food industry?
And that's it for this episode of Books and Banter. Thanks for tuning in.
Keep reading and keep those minds hungry for knowledge.
See you next time.